Hi, I'm Ava Lehner.
And I'm Andrea Lara Garcia.
And today we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War.
Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing.
The Vietnam War, also called the Second Indochina War and called the Resistance War against America and Vietnam, was a proxy war fought between North and Vietnamese forces during 1955 to 1975.
North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and backed by the USSR, attempted to reunify the country under communist rule after the country was split in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam had previously been a French colony.
The United States, having just lost the Korean War 2 years earlier, feared a complete communist takeover in Southeast Asia and got involved in the conflict to prevent Vietnam from falling into the hands of communists. This further led to other countries like Australia and South Korea to put their boots on the ground, and over 15 countries got involved in the war.
The Vietnam War is also called a proxy war because it was started by opposing powers who never became directly involved in the conflict, in this case, the Soviet Union. While the U.S. initially only sent financial and military aid to South Vietnamese forces, eventually the U.S. felt compelled to physically enter the war. The USSR, however, continued providing supplies, training, and weapons from afar. This indirect fighting between the USSR and the U.S. is characteristic of the Cold War tensions that were occurring during this time. Neither party wanted to risk direct conflict and spark a nuclear war.
Because Vietnam underwent such massive political turmoil during the 20th century, looking at maps of Vietnam during this era is always a great way to physically see how things changed in the country. So we're going to look at a couple maps of Vietnam before, during, and after the war.
As you can see, Vietnam was called French Indochina before the war and included Laos and Cambodia. When French rule finally ended, Vietnam was divided roughly along the 17th parallel into north and south.
You can see that the divide in this map of Vietnam during the war. The parallel became a demilitarized zone, much like what was done with Korea after their war. However, not all the fighting was done along this line, and both sides entered Laos and Cambodia to do their dirty work.
And this is a map of modern-day Vietnam, formerly known as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. From their official name, you can probably tell who won the war.
Enough about maps. Let's talk about why the war began.
Right. Well, as we previously mentioned, the Vietnam War had its roots in the French colonialism that preceded it. The Vietnamese, heavily inspired by communist ideology, attempted a revolt against their French occupiers. The French, funded largely by the United States, fought back until they faced a crushing defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. An accord was drawn up, and a demarcation line was drawn with the 17th parallel between the North and the South.
For the North, however, this wasn't enough. The president of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, didn't just want a communist Vietnam. He wanted a united communist Vietnam. So the Viet Cong was born.
Let's take a second to learn about Ho Chi Minh from my own professor cousin, Dr. Andre Lopez Garcoa. Hello, my fellow Americans. Ho Chi Minh was the communist leader of North Vietnam for most of the war. He fought against the South Vietnamese forces and Americans with his army named the Viet Minh. In 1954, Minh helped liberate Vietnam from French colonial rule in the First Indochina War. During the Vietnam War, Minh's main objective was to drive all Americans out of Vietnam and unify the country under communist rule. However, Minh died in 1969, 6 years before the war ended, and was not able to see the North's victory over the South.
Wow. Thanks, Professor.
The Viet Cong were a guerrilla force supported by the North Vietnamese army, who started launching widespread offensives against the South.
Eventually, the Viet Cong's offensive started causing serious damage towards the South Vietnamese army. The U.S., feeling compelled to intervene, started sending more aid under President Kennedy's watch. Kennedy strongly believed in the domino theory, which stated that if one Southeast Asian nation fell to communism, they all would. Because of this, he felt he needed to deepen U.S. involvement in the war.
Meanwhile, the situation in Vietnam continued to get worse and worse. Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam, was starting to show his true colors. To begin with, he hadn't even been democratically elected in the first place. The South Vietnamese elections were almost certainly rigged by Diem and his supporters. Furthermore, he was an incredibly corrupt administrator who was intolerant towards any religion that wasn't his own, Roman Catholicism. And this led to increased tensions between him and the majority Buddhist population, and actually led to some Buddhist monks burning themselves in an act of protest. His sister-in-law, Madame Nhu, was informally thought of as the First Lady of South Vietnam, and was equally as unpopular because she was an equally horrible person.
Speaking of Madame Nhu, I think Lizzie has some more to say about her and her charming personality. Let's hear more from Lizzie with her open letter.
Dear Madame Nhu, first of all, you were known as the Dragon Lady, which is probably a pretty good indicator of how you acted. For one thing, you were completely obsessed with French extravagance, which was ironic considering the Vietnamese collectively hated the French who had colonized them. So when you started using your power to accumulate wealth for yourself, the impoverished people of Vietnam were pretty upset. Later, when Buddhist monks started burning themselves in protest of your actions, you said, and I quote, "I would clap my hands to see another monk barbecue show." You even offered to supply the gasoline. You further stated that the only problem with the Buddhist monks' self-sacrifice was that they burned themselves with imported petroleum, which made them unpatriotic. So it was at this point that the United States stopped seeing you as the Joan of Arc of South Vietnam and started seeing you as the corrupt character that you really were. So even though you did improve upon problems like polygamy and prostitution in Vietnam, which ultimately benefited women, what you really did was fuel religious hatred, assist a corrupt government, and scare away most of the potential allies for your country. So I suppose that the Dragon Lady title really was fitting. Best wishes, Lizzie Capel.
Yes, charming. She ended up much better than her brother-in-law and husband, both of whom were assassinated in a coup. Ngo Dinh Diem's death was followed shortly by Kennedy's, who was replaced by Lyndon Johnson. Johnson only further escalated U.S. involvement, and he finally led the U.S. to physically enter the war in Vietnam when it seemed like the South Vietnamese army was about to collapse from mismanagement and lack of training.
Not our brightest idea.
Yeah, nobody's perfect.
It was hilariously unpopular, expensive, and destructive.
The U.S. in particular managed to destroy a good chunk of Vietnam's natural heritage when they started using a jellied gasoline to defoliate Vietnam's forests. This substance was called Agent Orange.
Fun fact, Agent Orange is notorious for causing severe birth defects in babies and serious burns on adults and children, and we were dumping that by the ton on the Vietnamese.
The tides of the war began to change, however, when the North Vietnamese launched a big, bold, unexpected attack on the American and South Vietnamese forces during the major Vietnamese holiday of Tet in 1968. The Tet offensive was highly coordinated, and even though it wasn't all that effective, it led to mass demoralization among civilians in South Vietnam and back home.
The war became even more unpopular when an event occurred that would question the morals and motivations of Americans involved in the war, the My Lai Massacre.
Let's hear a little bit more about it from Lizzie.
The My Lai Massacre, a horrible American atrocity or simply another regrettable war tragedy. It was a hugely divisive issue when word of the massacre first made its way to the general public, and it's still controversial today. But first, let's talk about what the My Lai Massacre really was. The My Lai Massacre is often attributed to the frustration of the American soldiers regarding the elusive Viet Cong. On the morning of March 16, 1968, a group of American soldiers called the Charlie Company entered and destroyed the Vietnamese city of My Lai. By the end of the day, the Charlie Company had shot and killed between 300 and 507 unarmed citizens. While it is known that the soldiers in the company were ordered to engage the Viet Cong in My Lai, it's not definitively known whether the soldiers were simply following their orders or if they decided to assume such a high level of violence totally on their own. Regardless, the My Lai Massacre remains one of the worst atrocities seen in this war.
God bless America.
Truly the best country in the world.
Anyway, shortly after this, Johnson decided not to run for re-election. Nixon, who as we all know is a sparkling example of American superiority, was elected after him and promised to quickly end the war.
Naturally, this didn't happen.
Instead, Nixon, advised by the infamous Henry Kissinger, started bombing the living daylights out of neighboring Laos and Cambodia in an attempt to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail that was supplying weapons to the Viet Cong.
Nobody said anything about it, though, because nobody outside of a few select people knew that Nixon was doing this.
Either way, his strategy was ineffective and failed to do anything to end the war. Eventually, Nixon just negotiated with the North Vietnamese government in Hanoi and pulled out his troops, ending American involvement in the war in 1973.
The war finally and officially ended 2 years after American involvement ended. The South Vietnamese forces collapsed within a year of the Americans pulling out, and the new president of South Vietnam, Nguyen Van Thieu, fled the country just days before Saigon fell to communist forces. On April 30th, 1975, the South Vietnamese government surrendered for good, and by 1976, a new socialist Vietnam had been established. This is the Vietnam we know and love today, and Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City for the leader who did so much to make his dream of a communist Vietnam come true.
All in all, the Vietnam War was destructive, brutal, and drawn out far beyond what it needed to be. Millions of people died in the conflict, and the war sparked anger and controversy in the U.S. and beyond.
Furthermore, Vietnam was almost completely razed. As we mentioned earlier, many of Vietnam's forests were completely destroyed, and Agent Orange fated many unborn children to be born with serious defects. The damage to infrastructure set Vietnam back years in terms of development, and modern Vietnam is still struggling to become fully industrialized.
Nowadays, most Vietnamese are too young to remember the day Saigon fell. Vietnamese millennials and younger also don't hold any animosity towards the U.S. and other allied nations. That seems to be the only territory of the older generation who can remember the atrocities of the war and who lost brothers and sisters.
The Vietnam War was a war of ideologies that ended poorly for all involved. All in all, a classic example of how Cold War tensions and the ongoing conflict between the USSR and the US became a global concern.
Hopefully the U.S. has learned a few lessons about foreign policy since then, and about getting involved in places where it shouldn't.
Good one.
Alright, that's a wrap. Let the credits roll.
Fighting soldiers from the sky, fearless men who jump and die, men who mean just what they say, the brave men of the Green Beret. Silver wings upon their chest, these are men, America's best.